So this is my multiple 3-4 defense. Why the 3-4? It forces offenses to figure out who the fourth rusher is. So this is a really, really big point. If you're coming from an even front scheme, whether that's 4-3 or 4-2-5, from the offensive perspective, what's the first thing that they're going to look at? Well, they're going to look at where are they setting the strength and where is that fifth rusher coming from. So you're going to be looking at 5-man pressures and fire zones. So fire zones would be a 5-man pressure with just three under, three deep behind it. So that's the first thing that an offense is going to do when playing an even front team is where is that fifth pressure coming from? Where is that sixth rusher coming from? Whether that's a hot pressure or a cover zero pressure. When you run a 3-4, because you're taking a defensive lineman out and subbing in another linebacker, you're adding another unique piece to your defense to now the offense when they're doing opponent scout, they're no longer just a gloss over the fourth rusher because they already know where the defensive linemen are. They already know where the four down front is. They're now looking for where's the fourth rusher coming from. And if you're very multiple with that, whether that's the outside linebackers or inside linebackers, you add another piece to the puzzle that they have to spend a ton of game plan prep for, which is why Dave Aranda was so well known for his 4-man pressures, his creepers. So you want to be very multiple with where the fourth rusher is, who he is, and where he's hitting, where he's starting, and where he's hitting from. So the next point would be odd front forces centers into 1v1s and multiple EGAP games. This is doubly true when you're at a small school and you don't have a ton of defensive linemen, offensive linemen. You only have a certain amount of hogs, and only a couple are typically going to be really, really quality. So if I want to be able to rush the passer or affect the run game just up front without playing any games behind it, I have to be able to get my best matchup on their worst matchup. Now, centers, I'm not saying are always the worst matchup, but they're already going to kind of be behind the buck because they obviously have to snap the ball. The easiest way to screw up an offense, and that doesn't matter if it's under center or if it's spread or if it's gun, whatever offense they run, the easiest way to do it is to mess the center up. So odd front automatically sticking a nose over a center. For me personally, I'm probably going to put my best defensive lineman because they're all kind of similar body types typically. They're all that wrestling body type. If I stick him right over the nose and it's my best kid, that's the easiest way to force fumble snaps, force high snaps. Sometimes if you really rattle a center, he won't even snap the ball, especially if it's loud. So odd front forces the center into 1v1s and multiple A-gap games. So you can still run the double A-gap mug stuff. Anything you can run A-gap to A-gap on either side, whether that's strong or weak, you're going to end up pretty good. And it's really effective. Doesn't matter what's going on around it. If the quarterback can throw the ball or not throw the ball, if you affect that center, then you're going to be good to go. Next point, offenses tend to give generic answers to odd fronts. So there's value in being unique. I'm going to say that over and over and over again. There's value to being unique. Odd fronts are typically, and this changes over decades. I think the 3-4 was more popular back in the 90s, and then in the early 2000s, everyone was going to the 4-2-5 scheme that guys like Patterson and Narduzzi and everyone was running with a quarter scheme, but they were running even fronts still. And now the odd fronts are kind of coming back. But typically, when you run something unique, you're going to get very generic answers to odd fronts. So we'll get into this a little bit later, but as soon as offensive coordinators see odd fronts, they're going to be thinking off tackle typically because your ends are going to be in fours or four eyes, and they're automatically going to be angles and leverage up front that are going to be able to attack the defensive line just naturally, just because of your 3-4 spacing. We see this a ton, so we see a lot of the same generic answers, even if on our opponent scout, sometimes we see 100% zone teams, and our opponent scout will get the game and they'll throw a ton of gap scheme at us just randomly, just because we're an odd front. And we might be I think we're the only odd front in the conference. There might be a 3-3 stack team, but that's almost a completely different ball game than a 3-4. So this shows up in pass protection a ton. We saw very heavy big on big protection, and we're going to get into the fifth clinic, I believe, is going to be pass protections, but we saw 75% big on big protection. And that's going to carry over if you were to talk to any 3-4 coach, that's at any level. If they're playing a spread team, so a 10 personnel team, where you're only getting 6-man protection, you're majority of the time going to see big on big protection where you're getting double fans. So the guards are going to be fanning out, the tackles are going to be fanning out. And that goes into the run game as well. You're going to see the same generic answers a majority of the time. The reason that's important is if you know what an offensive coordinator's first answer is going to be and you have a call for that first answer, well then now you're playing that chess game where you're trying to stay one type ahead of him. So he's thinking, okay, cool, they're playing odd front, I'm going to get off tackle. You're thinking, I already know he's going to go off tackle, so I'm going to have this call. Here's my call sheet for off tackle, and now let's see what his plan B is. A lot of guys won't have a plan B. You're doing all this opponent scout on Saturday and Sunday hoping that your plan A is really 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 good. Now you hope your scheme and your system's flexible enough to where you can get on Friday nights at halftime, you're able to, kind of get around the ball and you're able to flex and get into plan B or maybe even plan C sometimes. But if you can dominate their plan A, a lot of times you'll end up being good, or at least they'll be late to the ball game. Then obviously with the 3-4, more speed on the field to defend the modern spread offenses. So we see a ton of 10 personnel spread offense. Like I said, they're all very multiple and they do very, very different things. Last year, we saw one wing T team and they even came out in 10 personnel. They had a 10 personnel package. We saw one double wing team a couple years ago and they came out and they had a 10 personnel package. So they were still running trips. They were still going 2x2, 4 open. So almost everyone I see, at least where I'm at, has some sort of spread package, even in their old school offenses. So for that wing T team, that flexbone team, they were still running orbit motion, but it was coming out of 10 personnel now. So you need to be able to match their speed and them spreading the ball out with more speed on the field. And that naturally happens when you take a defensive lineman out and you sub in another linebacker that you're hoping can run and track the ball. And then it's also easier to get into even front spacing. Even front spacing would be like under over. So no zero tech over the nose. You're getting a shade and a 3 and double fives. It's easier to get into even front spacing from a 3-4 than vice versa. So if you look at 4-2-5 defenses, and I know Saban has his mint and tight package where they're playing mint 4 mod, and you have to have that because tight's really, really good against spread offenses that are trying to run inside zone and zone read and things like that into the interior gaps. Everyone wants that package, but it's a whole lot easier for me starting in a 3-4 to where I can just pull a string on the defensive line. I pull the 4-eye to a 5. I pull that 0 to a shade. I pull that 4-eye to a 3. And now all I have to do is drop down an outside linebacker to a 5 tech, and boom, I'm in even front spacing. Whereas if you went from even to odd, well, you either have to put in a different personnel package to take a defensive lineman off the field, or you have to teach a 5 tech, a defensive end, how to drop. Now, I'm not too big on that because that's a pretty expensive concept, is telling a defensive end how to play curl flat or how to play SIF. So it might be easier, like most teams do, is just to play mint, which is just tight, but it's in a different personnel package. So that kind of plays into the fact that we want to be very, very multiple. If we want to be multiple, we have to get into even and odd front spacing, and that's always easier from a lighter personnel package.